topic that I want to talk about tonight, I mean, it's very appropriate for Adar. Did everybody hear me? Yeah. In many ways, it's a very difficult topic. Seems simple, but it's not. What's the topic? I want to talk about the nation called Amalek. Now, we know about Amalek. We know from the Torah that right after the Jews got out of Egypt, they were attacked by Amalek. And Yoshua went to war with them, and he almost destroyed them, but apparently God said, don't destroy them. Whatever. And so we know about Amalek, and throughout the generations, Amalek, we know Haman, who was an Amaleki, right? And he, of course, also tried to destroy the Jewish nation. But what's interesting about that is when you look at the Torah, if not for the fact that the Torah had said that there was a nation called Amalek, and this nation of Amalek went to war with the Jews, I would never have believed it. The Torah says it, so I believe it. But I would never have believed it. Why? Because it's incredible. Let's take a look at why the concept or the fact that Amalek attacked the Jews is so highly improbable as to create an incredible astonishment that it even occurred. Let's take a look. First idea. The Medrash said that Amalek crossed 5 boundaries to get to the Jewish people. There was no military threat of the Jews. The Jews didn't want to attack Amalek. Amalek had to cross 5 boundaries, which shows you that we're really very far away. So if they're not a military threat, can you tell me why they want to go to war with the Jewish people? Certainly not because they were afraid of being conquered. So therefore, we see that there's no military threat, so that lacks a motive. Usually countries go to war because it's a military threat. They want to be taken over by another country, right? Or they want to be slaughtered or whatever. But why go to war when there's no military threat? Second of all, not only there was no military threat, there's no religious threat. What's a religious threat? People make a mistake. They think that Amalek were atheists, and they were annoyed at Jews because Jews were believers. So therefore, they took up the banner of atheism to destroy the Jews. But that's wrong. There was no such thing as atheism. No such thing. Atheism, in many ways, is a modern day invention. It comes as a result of Darwin and so on. But in those days, everybody believed in God. They believed in many gods. It's true. Polytheism. But there was no atheist then. I mean, look at Egypt. Egypt had a pantheon of gods. Every nation had gods. By Moloch, Baal, everybody worshipped some god, and so on. So what was the problem here? Amalek believes in their gods, whatever that is, and the Jews believe in its God. That's all. So why are you going to war for this? There's no ideological or really, in many ways, a religious threat at all. Second very strange thing. Third strange thing. Do you know what it costs to mount a war? The United States schlepped from the United States to Afghanistan. Do you know what it cost them? It cost them $1 billion a day to make a war in Afghanistan. Right? It's a fortune. So therefore, Amalek, you think about that, what are you doing? You know what it costs a fortune to make war against the Jews. And not only that, if you really want to think about it, what's even more strange, one of the most difficult parts of an enemy is what's called the supply line. You got to supply the troops with food and everything like that, you see. So usually what happens is the enemy, the army that does it, they take over property, farms and all that, and they take all the food from the farmers. But what the problem is what? It's a wilderness. Midbat Sin, these are wildernesses. There's nobody to take the food from. Therefore, they would have to supply, right, the army with an enormous amount of food over an enormous distance. How could you do that? For what reason? Fourth question. Egypt is the greatest nation on earth, on the Ramses. Jews destroyed Egypt, or rather God did, but the Jews destroyed Egypt. Egypt is the greatest power on earth. If the Jews destroyed Egypt, it stands to reason that anybody who wants to war with the Jews is a suicide trip. That's what I would think. Suicide. If they destroyed Egypt, which is the greatest nation on earth, correct? Then why would anybody start up with the Jews? Because obviously you don't start up with these people. You know, they didn't just vanquish Egypt; they demolished it, as we see with the Red Sea. The whole Egyptian army was killed, and they left Egypt in an economic disaster. You know, after the Borak got finished, and then the locusts and all that, there was nothing left in Egypt, and all the animals died. There's nothing left. So if you really think about it, what's going on here? You see, it's a suicide trip. So why would Amalek wage war with the Jews if they just destroyed Egypt? Not only that, we know that there's 600,000 males over the age of 20. So if you multiply that by 4, which is a family, that's 2.4 million Jews left Egypt. Do you have any idea how big the army of Amalek has to be to war with that type of population? It's insane. So when you begin to think about it, it makes no sense. It's impossible. Why would any nation go to war, right, if there's no motive? It's a suicide trip, and it costs a fortune. That's the question. Therefore, Amalek is not a simple idea. We need to understand what is going on in their minds, that they would war with the Jews, you see. And also one more question. Amalek appears right before Matan Torah, because that's when they fight Yoshua. Is there any significance in the fact that they appeared before the Jews received the Torah? Is that significant in and of itself? Maybe. We'll see. But in any case, it's very difficult to understand the whole parsha of Amalek, because no nation in the world would ever have committed themselves to a war when it cost them a fortune. It's a suicide trip, and there's no reason to do it. There's no military threat, there's no ideological threat, right? There's no religious threat. So what's going on here? That is the question that I'm going to try to answer tonight. Okay? Meanwhile, everybody can sit there and puzzle over it, because it makes no sense. I think I've sufficiently dramatized the improbability of Amalek making war against Jews. But we know what happened. Torah doesn't lie. Why? In order to understand why, we need to understand certain concepts of mankind. Man means man and woman, mankind, are very interesting creatures in a certain sense. People are always thinking, whether it be consciously or unconsciously, believe it or not, everybody either wants to become God, or he thinks he's God, or he wants to overthrow God. He may not admit it, and that's only because God is so powerful he can't even begin to entertain such a thought. But the truth is, everybody would love to be God, right? If I took a show of hands, everybody here would love to be God. You don't know how to do it, okay? So that in order to know how to become God, you have to come to the next year. But anyway, but I know you'd love to become God. You don't want that. You don't want that headache. Well, that responsibility. What?
Hard not being me.
What?
It's hard not being me.
Okay. Now, I'll tell you something. That's because you're not God. If you were God, you would have no problem being you. But that would be a contradiction, because why would you, anyway. Okay? In any case, everybody wants to be God, like I say. Who doesn't want to be omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, all over, right? Everybody wants that. Imagine, you never have to worry about bringing home a paycheck. It's incredible. So, you either want to be God, or you want to become God, you think you are God, or you want to overthrow God. It's one or the other. Okay. And the question is, do we see this in history? Yes. Let's take Adam Rishon, the first man. Why did Adam eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Why? Well, let's take a look at the argument that the Nachash the primordial snake, presented to Chava. He goes over to Chava, right, and he says to her different things, but the real clincher was what he said to her, right, Visen Kilokim, you could be God. You see? Why did Nachash use that argument? You can become God? Because Chava dreams of becoming God. You can't offer, if the Nachash wants to convince Chava, and she obviously followed the same arguments to Adam, you've got to convince them with an argument that they believe in, or they realize, hey, it's a good argument, right? So he said, you can become God. What does that mean? What was his argument? So he said the following. He said, you see that tree that God said not to eat? You know why he doesn't want to eat from that tree? Because he ate from that tree. Rashi says this. It's a medrash. He ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that's how he became God. There you are. You see, of course it was a lie, but that's what he said. So what he was telling them, Chava, and then subsequently to Adam, if you want to become God, just eat from the tree. Why doesn't God want you to eat from the tree? Because God does not want any competitors. He doesn't want any rivals. He wants to remain God alone. Right? And that's why he told you not to eat from the tree. You see. So what do we see? And Adam, of course, Chava bought the argument, and then she relayed that, and then she ate from the tree, and she realized the whole thing was a lie, whatever. And then she came over to Adam, and she said, by the way, she probably offered the same exact argument. Or else why would Adam have eaten from it? There's an explicit command by God not to eat from it. So she clearly offered the same argument, right? But what was the real argument? What was the real attraction? Becoming God. But if they never entertained the thoughts of becoming God, why is that an argument? And the answer is because everybody would love to become God. That's the concept. So Adam Rishon is an incredible proof, really, right, that the first man already thought about becoming God. He realized he wasn't God. Why did he realize that? Because he was created on the sixth day of creation, and he all of a sudden appeared in the whole Garden of Eden, so he realized he didn't make this, couldn't fool himself. So he knew he didn't make this, so he knew that God made it. So he saw that God is an awesome being, because it must have been incredible, Gan Eden, So he couldn't fool himself into thinking that he was God, but he certainly wanted to become God. And that, the Nachash realized that, and he ordered that as an argument, and therefore Adam and Chava, they both fell, because of a hidden desire of man to be God. Where else do we see this? Well, let's take a look. In Parshas Noach, there's a Migdal Bavel. There's a whole society building a tower to war with God, right? It's famous. They want to overthrow God, right? That's the whole point of the tower, right? To make war with God. And it's not one guy, so you could say one guy is crazy. It was a whole society of Shinar, which is probably Iraq, ancient Iraq, and so on. The whole Iraq, they want a war with God. Because then they built the towers, or it was a collective job. So what do you see? That mankind is busy thinking about either how to become God, or how to kill him, how to throw him out, to take him over. It's historical proof. What about a person thinking he is God? Well, unfortunately, there are guys like that walking around. Right? However, Pharaoh thought he was God. The pharaohs thought they were God. Even though clearly they know they're mortal. But the pharaohs thought they're God. And the Roman emperors think they're God. That's why they create so much sorrows and so on. But clearly there are people who are megalomaniacs. They really think that they are God in whatever capacity and so on. So what do we see? So we see, therefore, that this thought that mankind has of being God, becoming God, overthrowing God, or whatever, is something which is really embedded in us. And we see that historically, that this is the case. The question is why? Why should a person have a desire to think that he is God? He wants to be God, right? He wants to overthrow God. What's the origin of this thought, or this delusion, I should say? Because that's really what it is. It's a delusion. I'll tell you why. Because the problem that man has is that when he's born, he's an infant. Intuitively, an infant knows it is helpless. Intuitively. It knows that it screams and there's nobody around. And all of a sudden, it feels there's food coming into its mouth. And it begins to realize that it didn't put the food in its mouth. An infant is in tremendous contact with its helplessness. And this continues for years, you see. So therefore, what an infant begins to develop is the concept of inferiority. It begins to develop an inferiority complex. Who am I? Why am I? I'm really nothing. Because I'm completely dependent on other people to survive. This concept of an infant's helplessness goes on for years and for years. And it never evaporates at all. It's interesting, the unconscious mind doesn't know time. That's why there's so many adults that act like kids, if you ever noticed. You know, why? Because the ideas that they developed in the mind when they were a child, okay, what happened is they repressed those ideas because they were painful to admit. Kid doesn't want to admit that it's helpless. It tries to deny that because it's dangerous to admit that it's helpless, because how am I going to survive? So that thought of inferiority becomes repressed. And once something becomes repressed, it goes into what's called the unconscious. Okay? So it's not available to the conscious mind. But that never goes away. Why is that? Because the unconscious doesn't know time. So even though a child grows up and it's clearly not helpless anymore, right, it's still embedded. That's why there's so many adults that act like kids. Because what they thought as a child is still there. Unless you remediate them with all kinds of therapy, whatever, and so on. But every one of us has a child aspect to us. We've somehow never outgrown many of our childhood notions, and so on. Therefore, nobody wants to admit that they're helpless. Nobody wants to admit that we're inferior. Even when we get older, we still feel that we're inferior. How do we see this? What is the greatest psychological drive known to man? The greatest, actually, it's the second greatest. The second greatest drive known to man, okay, is who am I? What am I? It's the concept of inferiority. And therefore, everybody's trying to prove they're somebody. Ever notice? Whatever you do, you're always trying to prove you're somebody. But it's very subtle. But deep down, everybody's always trying to prove that there's something. There's somebody. There's a sense of self-esteem, self-worth. The pursuit of self-worth, it really goes on the entire life, you see. Why does a guy donate $1 million to a building? What does he care? He's got his name on it. Because he wants his name on it. So what? Because if he wants his name on it, what's going to happen? He's dead. And then people look at the plaque on the building and say, wow, you know, Reuben gave $1 million to the building. Reuben must be important. So therefore this person says, I want people to think I'm important. And if I'm important, then I am somebody. What do you mean? You're dead. You know, so what can you feel if you're dead? Doesn't make a difference. As long as people think I'm somebody, even after he's dead, right? It's chashuv. You see? Forget about on the lifetime. We're always trying to prove us somebody. That's the greatest psychological drive, basically. There is one drive which is more basic, which is self-preservation. The desire to exist and remain existing. But beyond that, everybody's seeking some type of affirmation of self-worth. You see. So therefore, where do we get this need to feel like somebody? Because we grew up as infants. You see, if a person would have grown up not as an infant, but as an adult, okay, which is interesting, then maybe he wouldn't have this feeling of inferiority, and therefore the need to prove that he's somebody, he's important, and so on. This concept of needing to feel like somebody is a very important drive in a person. It's responsible for the incredible amount of activities that we do, even though we don't realize that. It says in the Pasuk, Seine matonis yechye, right? If you hate gifts, you will live. Then you live. Why? Because if you accept gifts, that proves that you're dependent on somebody else for gifts. But if you're dependent, what happens? All of a sudden, it proves that you are helpless. Because you need somebody else. It shows you that you are dependent. If you're dependent, it's hard to live with those kind of feelings, you see. So therefore, man is always trying to deny his sense of inferiority or his sense of self-worth, the loss of self-worth. This is a very important concept and explains a great deal of behavior. Why everybody wants to be remembered, why people have to assert themselves, whether it be to their spouse or to be their co-workers, because in some fashion they're always getting a feeling of worth. I'm somebody, see? Why do people try to control other people? Because if I control you, I'm somebody. Why does anybody want to collect so much money? Because money gives me the power to do anything, and if I can do anything, I won't feel like nobody. You see, a great deal of things are tied. Why does a guy have to feel he's got to have security? A huge bank account, you see? Because I'm a nobody, and I'm not going to be able to survive, so if I have a bank account, I'm adequate, I'll be able to survive. You cannot believe the amount of behaviors that we do to compensate or to address the problem of our own inferiority. Anyway, it's a lot to talk about. But in any case, this leaves mankind in a terrible dilemma. What is the dilemma? A dilemma is a problem. What's the problem? If you do A, you're doomed. And if you do B, you're doomed. Either way, you're doomed. You see, that's a classic dilemma. What does that mean? Notice, if you have a boss, right? You hate your boss. You resent him. Now, if he's a good guy, you won't resent him as much. But if he's a bad boss, God help him, right? Why do we resent authority figures? Why? Because don't tell me what to do. Because if you tell me what to do and you control me, that proves I'm a nobody. So therefore, we resent authority immediately. You see, we resent the boss authority. Anybody who tries to control us, we resent. Why? Because it rubs against our need to feel like somebody. And when there's a boss over you, obviously, you're nobody. He can tell you what to do, and you better do it, or also fire you, and there's no money. You see? So that reinforces our feeling of inferiority. That's why mankind hates authority. All people hate authority. So if he's a good boss, fine. But deep down there's always a resentment. That's why everybody's trying to become the boss of everybody else. You see. And anyway, it presents man with a terrible dilemma. What's the dilemma? Here's the dilemma. If you believe in God, well, God is the boss. But wait a minute. I don't want a boss. I want to reject God because I want to deny my own need for somebody else. So in many ways, to believe in God is difficult because in essence you're believing in an authority figure. But that in many ways, God is a boss. And he's a real boss, and so on. You have to toe the line. But that automatically counters your need not to be bossed around because you want to feel like you're somebody. You see, and not only that, God not only controls you, but God controls your behavior. He tells you what to do. Don't tell me what to do. How many times do we stop a guy and we say, hey, excuse me, let you the boss. You know what I'm saying? Don't tell me what to do. I'm not going to go with who we have to clash all the time. But the essential idea is that we don't want to be told what to do. We want to live our lives according to the way we want to live our lives. Get out of my way. Basically is what we all feel. Okay. This is human nature. So therefore, a religious person, someone who believes in God, has got a real problem. He's got a real dilemma. Why? Because if he believes in God, right, then he, in a certain sense, he resents God because God stops him from enjoying life. You see? So that's one bad thing. On the other side, if he rejects God, well, if he believes in God, God's going to come after you because there's a concept of accountability, isn't there? Right? There's accountability, right? God says, hey, this is my list of things you need to do. And if you don't do it, you're going to be judged. That's called accountability, right? So it's a dilemma. What do I do? If I reject God, correct, then I got problems because he's going to come after me, right? If I reject him. If I accept him, then I feel like a nobody. I don't want him to stop me from enjoying life. You see. That's a real dilemma. What do people do? Well, I have to tell you something. Mankind is brilliant. They found a solution. Yes. We find solutions to problems that annoy us or problems that we can't solve. We found a solution. But mankind has found a solution to this dilemma. If you believe in God and you want to enjoy life, how do you have your cake and eat it too, as they say in English? Can you do both? Can somebody who wants to live his own life accommodate the belief in God at the same time? It would seem not. But the truth is, mankind has solved the problem. What is the solution to this problem? Well, you'd be shocked. That's what the solution is. The solution to this dilemma is all the religions of the world. Yes, as we'll see. Each religion really compromises God. And you do an incredible job. And we will go through the religions. And I will show you what mankind has done. And then you'll begin to understand Amalek and really what Judaism is. Let's take a look at the religions of the world. How they address this dilemma. Well, you can believe in God, right, and do what you want. Let me show you how. Well, there are different strategies. And each strategy is called a religion. You see, a religion is nothing more than a strategy of how to accommodate God and do what you want. Let's take a look. Okay, what's the best or the greatest strategy of all? Atheism. Don't believe in God. You don't believe in God, what's the problem? I can do whatever I want. Right? So therefore, atheism is a strategy not to allow God to interfere with your life. It's really what it is. But what's the problem with atheism? You know, you have to be an idiot to be an atheist. Why? Why is that? Okay? Why is that? Because the greatest proof that there must be a supreme being that created everything is the incredible complexity of life. It's impossible. The human mind, or the brain, has over 100 billion neurons. It's massive. The body itself, right, has 100 trillion cells. Well, a lot of it is really bacteria, but anyway. But it has an enormous amount of cells. Each cell is a factory. There are more chemical reactions going on in a cell, or certainly the human body, than all the chemical reactions in the entire world. Who ordered this? You know how complex that is? It's beyond belief. In fact, I will illustrate it. It's a very cute idea, very interesting. Okay? This is a beautiful illustration. Well, you cannot be an atheist. Out west, 100 years ago, there's a whole bunch of guys playing a poker game. Okay? Now, they had the pot in the middle, right? The money. It was out west. It was cowboys, right? And they're playing poker. Okay. All of a sudden, some guy puts down his hand, right? And his hand was a straight flush. Now, I don't play poker, so I'm not sure what that is, but I think what it is it's like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of one suite, like clubs or hearts, whatever. Maybe there's some Mavina over here. Guys don't know what this is. But anyway, he had a straight flush. Puts it down. And everybody says, forget it. I can't be a straight flush. You know how rare that is? You know? So the guy takes his hand, and he's about to put on the money. And all of a sudden, one of the guys on the side, the cowboy is playing also, he stops him and says, excuse me, what are you doing? He says, what am I doing? I got a straight flush. You know? Nobody's going to beat this. He says, yeah? And he throws down his hand, and it's a royal flush. Now, I think what a royal flush, right, is 9, 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace.
10, Jack, Queen, King.
10, Jack, Queen, thank you. Okay? Right? It's a royal flush. That's the top of the line. Am I right? Okay. However, so everybody's stunned. A straight flush and a royal flush in the same hand. So the guy with the straight flush stands up and he says, "You no good, dirty cheater." He pulls out his gun and he kills the guy with the royal flush. Now, forget about if the guy with the royal flush deserves death. I'm not going into that. Maybe out west they had a different set of rules for what justice is. But the question is, well, excuse me, how do you know he cheated? Maybe he really had the royal flush. You had the straight, you had the royal, so yeah, but you lost. How do you know the guy cheated? So they asked this guy, how do you know he cheated?
He cheated.
What?
He cheated.
No. No. You know how? Because he said the probability that in one hand there should be a straight flush and a royal flush is a 1 followed by 40 zeros. You know what 40 zeros is? It's a number that we don't even imagine. Now, so he turns to the guy and says, okay, what should I assume? That this was the one time in the 40 zeros that it happened, and maybe Taka it happened, or that the guy cheated, which is more reasonable? Of course, that the guy cheated. The probability that an insulin molecule should develop by itself is a 1 followed by 80 zeros. Come on, 80 zeros? Therefore, it's impossible, really, to be an atheist. It's impossible. In fact, what's interesting, there was a skeptic, I forgot his name, in England. He was a big skeptic, and he used to try teach in Oxford, I think he was. And finally, when he was very old, he said, I forget, I believe in God. So they were shocked, these students. You believe in God? Even preaching there's no God. Atheism for all the years. Skepticism. So they asked him why. So he said, because complexity. It's impossible. When you look at the complexity of the world, it is impossible to think that this occurred by chance. It's like what Fred Hoyle, a famous cosmologist, once said. He said the probability that this world came about by chance, the 100 million, or rather the 100 million life forms and so on, whatever, chance, it's more likely that a hurricane went through a junkyard, right? And all of a sudden, in the junkyard was sitting a Boeing 747. That's more likely than for this world to have been created by chance, or have by chance. This is good, Fred Hoyle. You know. In any case, so you can't be an atheist. But, you know what you can't be? You could be an agnostic. Agnostic says, I don't know, prove it. In other words, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. So, until you prove it, I'm going to do what I want. You see? That's the strategy. Right? If God comes and talks to me, fine, then I'll do it. But if not, then I can do whatever I want. So agnosticism is a strategy, right? To do whatever you want. But it's hard to be an agnostic, again, because of the complexity. So we now have to go into the real concept of religion. So we come to the religion of Aristotle. Aristotle believed there's a God, a first cause, and he created the universe. But then God removed himself from the universe, right? He created the world and said, okay, you guys, you're on your own. Great. If we're on our own, there's no standard, there's no accountability, do whatever you want. So you can believe in a God, the Aristotelian God, and do what you want. Strategy, you see? So there already we begin to enter the concept of religion. So you can accommodate doing what you want with religion by believing that God has nothing to do with the universe. That's number 3. Number 4. I don't know if that's going to work, because it's obviously, and by the way, God counters that belief by saying, I am the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt, which means I intervene in the affairs of man. That statement that I took you out of Egypt directly contradicts Aristotle, that God intervenes in the affairs of man and he took the Jews out of Egypt. Very important phrase. Okay, so that's 3. Number 4, a 4th strategy. What's that? You believe in 2 gods. Zoroastrians believe in 2 gods. Persia, that's the religion of Persia. In the olden days, certainly. What do they believe in? They believe in a God of good and a God of evil. And they're at war with each other. So you know what I do? The guy says, I'm going to align myself with the God of evil. Because he's evil. I can do whatever I want. You see? The God of good, the God of evil will protect me. You see? So by creating 2 kinds of gods, good and evil, he's protected. And therefore he can do whatever he wants. That's a strategy. You see? That's a 4th strategy. However, is that really great strategy? No. There's a better strategy. Bilam. When the Rebbeinu came off to Bilam, when Balak called him to curse the Jewish people, so on the way there was the messengers from Balak, so God says to Bilam in a dream, who are these guys outside? So Bilam said to himself, that's very interesting. I thought God was omniscient, He knows everything. Clearly God doesn't know everything. If that's the case, wow. So if I can do whatever I want, God won't know it because He's not omniscient. What a solution. That means I can actually try to do things that He won't know because He doesn't know everything. Bilam. That's what Bilam's belief was, you see. So that's a fourth strategy. Actually, it's a fifth. A sixth strategy. And most of the world has adopted this strategy. Certainly in ancient times. Polytheism. The belief of many gods. How does that help you? The Greeks believed in a pantheon of gods. There were 50 gods that they believed in. And Rome, these are major powers for 1,000 years. And at that time, the paganism, which is really polytheism, how does that help you? And the answer is, because if you believe in many gods, right, each god will have a different shita. He has his own ideas and values, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the Kulei Beis Shammai and the Kulei Beis Hillel. You see, I'm going to take whatever I want to do. I'll always find a god that will say it's okay. So therefore, by believing in many gods, right, I can pick and choose which god I want to believe in and worship, because between them all, they're going to allow me to do everything. Right? Brilliant. That's the brilliance of polytheism. I can pick and choose whatever I want. You see? Another strategy. Okay. What happens if you're not polytheistic? So you're going to do another strategy. I'm showing you major religions of the world are really based on this. Another strategy. Well, I want to do a lot of things. I want to murder. Right? So what am I going to do? So I will believe that my God murders. I'm going to invest in God the exact same vices and bad things that I want to do. I'm going to say that He does it. And that's exactly what the Greeks did. They made their gods commit vices, murder, jealousy, you name it. You know, if you're familiar with any of the Greek mythology and so on. So therefore, there's a mitzvah according to the Torah, lihidamas b'drachov, to imitate God. That's exactly what they did. But the brilliant thing is they had God actually doing the things that they would love to do. You see. Another strategy is where, okay, God isn't that, but you know, the avodah will be immoral. Vices, immorality, that's the avodah. You'll find many religions in ancient times that are all kinds of immoral service, without getting into the gory details and so on. And even Baal Peor, which the Torah mentions, their avodah, if you know what it is the avodah of excretion. They used to excrete right in front of their God. Why would they do that? Are they crazy? Because it was an avodah of such degradation, right, that you can do anything, even if it's degrading. You see, if you look at religions, it's incredible what man thought of just to get away from believing and having to do what God wants. So what they did is the avodah, you see, they had all kinds of the Vestal virgins. I don't go to their avodas, but they had all kinds of incest, you know, licentiousness going on, immorality, in their temples. Why? Because that's the avodah. So on the contrary, it's mutter, it's a mitzvah. Right? Okay. Another strategy is where God changed His mind. Yeah, Christianity. In the beginning, God created the world, He gave the Torah. But He saw the Torah was so difficult, so He changed His mind. He said, if you believe in my kid, that He gave His life, my kid. If He gave His life for grace, it's called grace. He gave His life in order, He was crucified on the cross, in order to redeem mankind, right? That's all you need to do to get Ulam Habo. What does that mean? So God changed His mind. The original base Israel were Jews, and now it's the Christians, right? Not only that, He changed the Torah. Originally it was the Torah, and now it's the New Testament. You see, so therefore you change your mind and you now remove all the mitzvahs That's incredible. So in order to get in the Mahabharata, all you have to do is believe that this guy came along and sacrificed his life, right, in order to redeem mankind from the original sin of Adar, whatever they say. And so, right? But that's incredible. You see, that is what they believe, and that removes all the mitzvahs. Everything, basically. And then the last one is always very interesting. Right? A guy sins. He's got to be worried. He sins. He needs a kapara. Right? It costs a lot of money to buy an animal for chatos. You do a shogeg, a sin in shogeg, or whatever, it costs a lot of money. You got to bring a chatos. That's an animal. That costs at least $1,000 to bring that animal, $500, so you wouldn't sin so often because it costs a lot of money, right? But here's a better way. Why is that? What's the problem here? Because the problem is the only one who can forgive you is God. Alright? And you want forgiveness from God, you got to do a certain amount of things. So Christianity, Roman Catholicism came up with an incredible idea. The priest can forgive you in confession. Yeah. Man can forgive man. Isn't that incredible? But of course, when man is going to forgive man, what is he going to do? He's going to ask you for a donation, won't he? And there you are. They used to buy the kaparas. And after a while, that's called confession, right? You give to the church, whatever, and you get a kapara. That's what confession is. Because they gave the power of kapara to man, to the priest. After a while, it got so bad, where the priest would say, listen, there's a sale on today, right? If you do one sin, it's $100, right? So normally you do two sins, $200, but it's a sale for $150. I will forgive you not only for what you did, but for what you will do. It's called the mafreya. Obviously that it got out of hand, which is incredible. So Luther, that's why he rebelled against the Catholic Church, right? That's why he created Protestantism, Luther, and he said this is ridiculous, it's called indulgences. After a while they were selling the ability to do sins in the future for hard cash. That's why the church was the richest institution in the world in the Middle Ages, you see. Anyway, look at all these incredible strategies. Why are they? What do? They all allow you to believe in God and do whatever you want. They've all neutralized, compromised God. That's what it is. So what happens? Along come the Jews. And they said, oh no, here's what the Jews did. One, there's a God. One. There's only one God. Forget about the rest of the crew. There's no polytheism here. There's only one God. Not only that, He is righteous. He is moral. He's ethical. Right? He is just. Not like the other guys. Right? And not only that, He wants you to be righteous and just and moral and ethical. There's no exit. Where's the strategy? How do I do what I want to do and believe in God? With Judaism, you can't do that, really. Because if you believe in God in Judaism, in a certain sense, you're stuck. You see, because there's no strategy where you can compromise God. Very important idea. And now you know a very important concept. Why did Nimrod hate Avraham Avinu? Why? What did Avraham Avinu do? Okay, so he smashed a couple idols. Why did he hate him so much and throw him into the furnace and so on? Because what Avraham said was radically different than everybody else. Avraham Avinu said, this is what Judaism is. There's only one God. He is righteous, unjust, Sadik Yashar, said Nazino, right? And not only that, he said not only is God this way, but all your other gods are wrong. See, everybody else, if you're polytheistic, everybody's right? You can worship here, you can worship there, everybody's right. But Judaism says everybody's wrong, except us. You see? Wow. So therefore, so Nimrod said, wait a minute. If we're all wrong and you're right, there's no exit. There's no compromise possible. You're the most dangerous man alive. You need to be put to death. Because your form of belief destroys us. It destroys our ability to do whatever we want and then to feel like a somebody. You see? And that tells you a very important concept. Why is there anti-Semitism? There are many reasons. Jealousy, right? A lot of reasons. But I believe the real reason boils down to one idea. Anti-Semites don't hate Jews. They hate God because of what He did to them. And therefore they hate us because we are His ambassadors. That's why. They never forgave the Jew for introducing Judaism. They never forgave us. In the end, what we did, in many ways, is we gave them a conscience, you see. We made them into whips. We forced them to serve God. Not that God serves man, but man has to serve God. The origin of anti-Semitism is the Jew, what he believes in, goes contrary to the thing that a person wants. And that is to be independent, fully self-functioning, and don't tell me what to do. That's the root of anti-Semitism, you see. And intuitively, everybody knows the concept of the Bible, right? The Torah. The Bible is the greatest book ever published, and it's world known. And when you read the Bible, what's the first thing you begin to see? The righteousness of God, the justice, right? The morality, the ethics, and so on, you know. What do you think a guy feels when he's reading that? He's at war with himself. Part of him would like to believe this. When part of him says that you had in mind, you believe this, you can't do anything. Because you got to do exactly what God wants. That is the origin of anti-Semitism, in the end. And that's the concept of Avraham Avinu trying to be killed by Nimrod. It's interesting. You see. One more idea. It says in the Torah, we call the mountain Torah was made by Har Sinai. Yes? The mountain of Sinai. So the Chazal say, why is it called Sinai? Because it's a lashon of sinah. Because Matan Torah at Sinai brought sinah to the world. Hatred. Hatred? Where'd that come from? What I'm saying. Because Sinai brought a religion that doesn't allow man to compromise God. And therefore everybody hates that. And therefore they hate the Jew because he's the bringer, the messenger of what the Moshe wants. That's the sinner. Because other than that, it doesn't make any sense. On the contrary, the Torah introduced an incredible amount of what? Of morality and so on, how society can live with each other. But what the Torah did is far more than that. It brought sinner. It does not allow man to do whatever he wants. You cannot compromise God. That's the sinner. And therefore, intuitively, you feel difficult to accept the Torah because it goes against the grain of human nature, you see. Now that you understand this, okay, we can now go back to what? To all the questions I asked about Amalek. What was the first question I asked? Okay, first question. Why did they go to war with the Jews? There's no military threat. No. It's true, there's no military threat. But there is an ideological threat. Amalek intuitively realized that what the Jews are about to offer the world is a religion which is intolerable because it doesn't allow us to compromise anything. You know, it makes us slaves submit to the Varsham. We can't allow that. And therefore they said, which is incredible, what we must do is we must kill the Jews. We cannot allow a religion that offers no strategy to compromise. You see. So it was a religious problem, not a military problem. And they hated the Jews so much because of that, just like Sinai, that they were willing to commit suicide, Moshe Nefesh for that, because they knew they would lose. You can't fight a nation that just wiped out Egypt. You can't fight a nation that not only wiped out Egypt, right? It's got 2.4 million people, right? You can't do that. And not only that, it's a fortune. To spend money on that kind of a war is a fortune to cross 5 borders. But it's worth it to destroy this nation because they are bringing something intolerable to the world. You see, that answers who Amalek really is. They cannot stand the fact that Judaism does not allow them to do whatever they want, and therefore they're willing to be Moshe Nefesh, even if it means their own death. And you will see, a little while, an incredible historical precedent for that. But now you understand something else. And I didn't ask, and also you understand why they attacked right before Matan Torah. Because the Torah was about to be given, right? That would have given this religion to the people, to the world. So right before the Torah was given, they had to attack the Jews. Because they knew the Jews were going to go to Sinai, because they told that to Pharaoh, we want to worship our God on that mountain. So they knew that the Jews were going to receive something at Sinai, but wherever it is, it's going to be Judaism. And Judaism is anathema to human nature. So here's a nation that hated Jews, sinner, because they were going to introduce a religion that you cannot compromise God. And now that answers really the ultimate question. Why does God hate Amalek? You look at the Torah, you say, wow, Moshe Timche, you didn't kill him, you killed them. My seat isn't filled, my Chesed, Ki Yoda Kes Ka. Right? The hand of Amalek is against the throne of God. And therefore, Moshe Timcha, you have to wipe out every man, woman, and child. We're talking about God who is infinite Rahmanas. Why? How do we understand this? And the answer is, because the most dangerous man in the world, or the most dangerous nation, is a nation that mocks, not God, but the sovereignty of God. Notice what it says, Ki Yod, the hand of Amalek is against the throne of God. It doesn't say that the hand of Amalek is against God, right? It's just a throne. What is the throne? The Chesed, right? The throne is the symbol of the sovereignty, of his ability to rule over you. Sure, they believe in God, because they're polytheistic, you know? But what they did is they rebelled against his sovereignty, his ability to command us in an absolute way. It's Meduyak in the Pasuk. That's why. So not only does the verse say, that's the most thing, I'd rather have an atheist than an Amaleki. Why? Because an atheist, eventually he'll grow wise and he'll say, hey, so you think you can't be an atheist? You know? But if you believe in God and you compromise God, you've mocked his Ol Malchus Shemayim. You've mocked the whole concept of the Ol Malchus Shemayim, which is the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. That's why we say Kriya Shema twice a day, to be makabel the oil. You see? It is so important to accept the sovereignty of God that we say it twice a day. And that's exactly what they were against, the Ol Malchus Shemayim. You see, that's why God said, you need to wipe them out. You need to wipe the Sefer out. Because God does not want anybody to remember them. Because to remember them is to repeat their philosophy. And to repeat their philosophy means to make it attractive to people. We need to compromise. You see. So therefore the greatest enemy of God is a person that not denies his existence, but who mocks his ability to issue commandments, his sovereignty. In fact, an incredible reference is what? How do you spell Amalek? Ayin, Mem, Lamed, Kuf. Yes? That's the Rosh Tevus of Ol Malchus Lo Kiblu. The same basis. Oil Malchus Lo Kiblu, that the kingdom of heaven they don't accept. So it's not that they deny the existence of God, because they believed in gods. They deny his ability to be a sovereign. So they created a compromise. But what's even worse is that they were willing to be mercy nefesh. That type of self-sacrifice demands that they be wiped out. You see. And it answers a fundamental question of why God hates them so much. Now that we understand this, we can understand some things about Haman. Right? Haman doesn't make sense. Again, when you look at Haman, what he did is absurd. Let me show you. Okay? Ahasuerus is the greatest emperor of all. Got 127 countries under him. What an empire. Okay? And who's the second in command? The Grand Vizier? It's Haman. Correct? Haman is the Grand Vizier. Now, you're mad at Mordechai because Mordechai doesn't bow to you. Right? Okay, so kill Mordechai. What do you want to kill all the Jews for? Are you crazy? I mean, Haman isn't stupid. Right? You don't become stupid to become the Grand Vizier. You're a bright guy. You see. What are you killing all the Jews for? You don't like Mordechai? Kill him. What are you doing this? What kind of a racist is that? Who ever heard of something like that? You see. And not only that, nobody wants to wipe out an entire nation. You need the economy, economically. The Jews are very loyal and so on. So why would he kill everybody? First question. Second question. Okay? He asked one of his guards, who's this guy that's not bound to me? So the guy said, they told him he's Mordechai HaYehudi. Kihu Yehudi, he's a Jew. Well, who cares what he is? Kill the guy and finished. Why the fact is he identified as a Jew makes such a difference? Third question. Why does the Megillah always keep saying Haman Huagogi Ben Hamdoso and so on? Right? Well, it's always repeating his yichus. You know, he said it once, we know who the guy is, and that's all. Why do we need a constant reminder of his genealogy? And the fourth question is even more bizarre. What was his argument to Achashverosh to kill him? Because he needed Achashverosh's permission. He goes to Achashverosh and says, listen, Yesh Am Meforet Mefuza, and there's a nation, they ain't dos, their religion is different. You know, everything about them is different. You know, if you approve, let me kill them all. So obviously Achashverosh said, excuse me, you want to kill the Jews, you know how much tax I'll lose? So he said, okay, I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver in order to compensate for the fact that you won't get the money from them. How much is 10,000 talents of silver worth in today's terms? The estimate is worth $100 million. A lot of money. He's a very wealthy man, Haman. That's what you become when you're the Grand Vizier. You know? The one who obviously learned from Haman is Hillary Clinton. But anyway, you know, if you're up there, you can bribe everybody, you know, just collect for all the bribes. But in any case, but it doesn't make sense. We know that Ahasuerus ruled over 127 different countries. But wait a minute, each one had their own religion, didn't they? They had their own belief system, their own social values, their own culture, their religion. So how can you say the Jews have a different religion? That doesn't make any sense. Everybody has a different religion. So what was the argument that Haman said? Got it? Makes sense. So therefore, this is what happened. Haman saw that Mordechai doesn't bow. And that was bizarre. Why? Because when the Grand Vizier comes in front of you, you bow. Why? Because it's to your benefit that you're showing obeisance, as they say, right? And if you do that, he'll like you, and maybe he'll do things for you, right? Like cut your real estate property tax, right? And so on, right? That's what a guy does, because it benefits him. But he saw Mordechai doesn't want to bow. So he realized Mordechai must believe in a God that cannot be compromised. You want to bow for your benefit, too bad, right? No, God says you cannot bow before man. So he realized that. He says, wait a minute, this guy's not bowing, even though it's beneficial to him, because he must have a belief system where his God doesn't allow, right, any compromise, even if you benefit. So he asked his God, who's this guy? So the God said, he's Jew. So he said, he's a Jew? Wait a minute. I'm an Amaleki. I have a yichus. My ancestors took on a mission to kill all the Jews precisely because they cannot compromise God. So therefore I need to take up that slack and finish the job. And therefore I need to kill Mordechai and all the Jews, because I need to do what my ancestors did. I need to take up their cause and do it also. That's what he realized. And that's why the Megillah constantly says the yichus. Why? Because he's not doing it because only he hates the Jews. He really took up the mission of Amalek, his ancestors. And the Mishnah wants to show you that that's really what he's doing, right? And so they keep repeating his yichus all the way up to Agog, which goes back to Amalek. And that's what he told Ahasuerus. He said, listen, of course we have 127 different religions. But these guys are not like anybody, they're not like anybody else. Everybody else figured out how to compromise God. These guys insist that you can't. They're different than every other religion on the world, as I've shown you. Right? We got to do away with them. In fact, they're the most dangerous species of all. This is the concept of Haman. When we see this today, it's incredible we see it today. I told you that the real origin of anti-Semitism is they've never forgiven the Jews for what they did to us. Right? Which is what? You've made us into wimps. You gave us a conscience. We'll never forgive you for that. You see? Yeah, of course on one side they say we accept the Bible. Yeah, of course. But deep down, there's a tremendous resentment. Because you've taken away, you've forced them to submit to another authority, which is anathema to human nature. But what happens now? Right? Who did that? Hitler, Yamach Shemoi. Do you know why Hitler hated the Jews? He writes that in Mein Kampf. The reason why he hated the Jews, because the Jews, he says, they have made mankind into wimps. He has given them a conscience with their morality nonsense. That's why he hated the Jews. Who does that sound like to you? It's Amalek. Germany is Amalek. And Hitler is a Gilgal of Haman. Not going to how. But he is repeating the exact same argument as Amalek. And he wrote that. And that's why he hated the Jews. He writes that. Because with them you cannot compromise God. And if you think about it, what did Hitler believe in? Nietzsche, the Superman, Deutschland über alles. That's their anthem, right? Whoever heard of something like that? Blonde hair, blue eyes, the Aryan race. They're a bunch of megalomaniacs. A megalomaniac should submit to God? Excuse me. The very nature of Germany is to oppose God. You see. And therefore, that's what he was. And Hitler's really an Austrian, but Austria is really German, and so on. And therefore, that's why he wanted to kill the Jews. Because they believe in the opposite. They believe in the supremacy of man, which is Nietzsche's philosophy. So the exact opposite, the most dangerous thing to their philosophy is Judaism. And since the Jews represent Judaism, we need to kill them. It's a very important idea. But there's something even more incredible. There's a book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. He writes an incredible idea, it's a historical fact. He said at the end of the war in 1945, what was happening? Hitler, the generals came over to Hitler and they said to him, we're losing the war. It's over. You're dreaming of a 1,000-year Third Reich, right? Third Reich, 1,000 years? Forget it, it's not going to last a year. We're losing the war. So Hitler said to them, why? What's the problem? Germans were incredible fighters. I mean, they could have conquered the world. If not for the fact that God stopped them, they would have conquered the world. In any case. So Hitler asked them, what's the problem? So he answered, the generals answered, because instead of using the cars, the railroad cars, to ship the troops to the front, you're using them to ship the Jews to the concentration camps. We don't have any railroads. And therefore we have nobody fighting. So you need to stop this. Stop obsessing about the destruction of the Jews. Do you know what Hitler told them? Get lost. When you get lost, you've just condemned Germany to lose the war. It's astounding. Doesn't that sound like Messiah's Nefesh? It's Amalek all over again. His obsession with killing the Jews because they refused to compromise God is the greatest evil of mankind. Because they gave mankind a conscience, right? He was so obsessed with killing them, which is classic Amalek, right? That he was willing to commit suicide, which is what he did. He committed suicide in the end, and Germany lost the war. In fact, if you think about it, Hitler was the greatest traitor of Germany. Because it's madness. No guy would have done that. He said, oh, forget about the Jews. I'm dreaming of a 1,000-year Third Reich. Right? Is he out of his mind? But he put the destruction of the Jewish people above the victory of Germany. And he was willing to go to the grave because of it. Who does that sound like? Amalek. It's exactly what it is. So Amalek never died. It still exists. But most people harbor those ideas. But they keep it down. Because they practice their religions that compromise God in many ways. You see, every once in a while, some guy gets up, just says openly, I hate the Jews. But that is the origin of anti-Semitism, really. And Hitler was the proof. You see, once you understand that, you understand certain very interesting ideas, and so on. Do you ever notice, why does the Torah always saying, right, Vayas Moshe kasher tzivah Hashem es Moshe. And Moses did exactly as God commanded. Why? It says numerous amounts of times. And Moshe did what God commanded him. What does that mean? Because he never inserted his own ideas to compromise God. That was the greatest thing. When a Jew does exactly what God wants. Kashetzivo Hashem es Moshe. As God has commanded Moshe. That's the greatest shvach, praise, which means that he doesn't insert any of his own ideas, any of his own needs, any of the strategies of all the religions. He does exactly to the letter of what God wants. That's why it says that. You see, it's amazing when you think about it. There's an idea which I once heard from Shalom Shvagron, famous Maggid. It says in the Yom Kippur davening, when you cut al-Chet and so on, it says, I forgive me. Why? Because Moshe or Sal Tom, that which you forbade, he tarti, I permitted. And it also says, Umashe he tarto, but what you forbade, I made forbidden. So Rav Shalom said, wait a minute, I understand this. I can understand you need a kapara because you said it was forbidden, and I mated it. So it's a chet. But if you permitted it, and I asked it, why is that a chet? So he said a very important concept. But it's a long time ago. He said because the chet there isn't because you did an avera, because you didn't. It's permitted by God, except you want to forbid it, fine. But why did you forbid it? Because there's ego involved, because you want to prove you're somebody. Alright? So therefore, I said it was permitted. So who are you to say it's forbidden? Because you're obviously investing ego in it. Because if I put it in, everybody's going to say, wow, what an incredible Talmud Chacham. He asked it, he was machmer. Don't be machmer, it's mutter. Because you put in your own ego. You didn't do kasher, tziva Hashem es Moshe. You see, and that's the chet. It's interesting. So we understand, look what we understand now. You should know the greatest pitfall in the avodah, the greatest, is to compromise God. You see, not to deny God. People don't deny God. We're not into overthrowing God, right? We're not crazy, right? We're not to think we are God, and we don't think we can become God, right? So what do? We're always trying to compromise God. It's called looking for heter. Now, it's more okay, look for heter if there's a heter. You see, but mankind is always involved in compromising devotion. And you can't do that really. Yeah, you follow the Shulchan Aruch. It's mutter, that's fine. You see, but you notice, therefore, that mankind is preoccupied always with compromising devotion. Because a person always wants to do what he wants to do. He wants to rebel against authority. That's what he has to do. And this is really, in the end, what Amalek was. Amalek was a nation that realized that they were the first true anti-Semites. Egypt was not anti-Semitic. They just wanted slaves. Therefore they used the Jews. Did they hate the Jews per se? No. If they would have hated Jews, then Levi never did any avodah. Levi was never subjugated in Egypt. They would have killed Levi too, you see. But they didn't hate them. But they weren't truly anti-Semitic because the Jews were there, but they needed them economics. That's why. Same thing with Roman Greece. Roman Greece didn't really hate the Jews. They just stood in their way of power. Greeks, they stood in their way to rebel. Don't rebel. We want to control you. Right? We want to take your territory, we want to charge you tax, and so on. Where did anti-Semitism first originate? Do you know where? Christianity. That's where it begins. Because we killed their God, so to speak, and that's the real hatred of Jews. That's where it began. You see. Because we don't believe in their guy, right? We believe in the Torah. But the Torah you cannot compromise, you see. But their guy, right, in the New Testament it says, I come not to abrogate the law of Moses, which is the biggest joke, because then he abrogates everything. Abrogate means to nullify. Then he nullifies everything, you see. That's what the New Testament does. Just gets rid of all the mitzvahs, and so on. So therefore, they hate Jews for that. Because their guy himself was Jewish, you see, which bothers them to this day, right? And not only that, their religion compromises what Judaism doesn't. This is the concept of Amalek. Amalek isn't something that existed a long time ago. Amalek is a here and now phenomenon now. And that's really Germany and all the anti-Semites out there. Why does everybody hate Jews so much? Why do you hate the Jews? Probably it's because of the double standard. What's the problem of Christians all the time? And the answer is, this is the answer. Because Torah created Sinai. Why? Because we gave them a religion, a set of beliefs that does not allow God to be compromised. There's only one God. He is righteous, just in everything, and He is an absolute ruler. He has accountability, and you need to toe the line, or else you got problems later on. That's the true origin of anti-Semitism. That's Amalek. But Amalek was a nefesh to do it. Just like Hitler Machemon. He'd rather die than have the Jews remain. You see. So, this is the keenness of Amalek. And now you know why God hates them. Because it's the greatest mockery of all. The mockery where you believe in God, yet you mock His sovereignty. You're not makabel the old malchus. So what's the whole point? What's the whole point? If you do whatever you want to God, the whole thing is a joke. You see. God does not tolerate jokes. Not that kind. He can deal with an atheist. Or he can deal with somebody who's already what the Zohar. You know. But don't believe in me and then pull up the strategy where you can do whatever you want. That is completely against Kabbalah's Ulma Kushamayim. And that is so important, we say Kriya Shema twice a day. You see. That's how important that is. You see. In any case, so this is the keenness of Amalek. It's something to remember. And you also understand ideas of Haman. That all he did was he followed up on the mission of his ancestors. You see? And that's why he said to Achashverosh, what they do is, no other religion does that. There's no exit. There's no out. You need to kill them all. You know. And thank God, God protects us from that. You see. But this is what's called the eternal problem the Jews have. Is that we represent God, we represent His belief system, and people will always hate us for that. I don't care who they are. But it doesn't always have to be that way. A person can submit, you see. Look, Islam hates us also for that reason. Because what they do, they chucked all the mitzvahs. That's what they did. And not only that, they can kill everybody because they said their God kills. Infidel. Wipe out the infidel. That's where ISIS gets its whole head done. You know, they do exactly one of the strategies. They want to murder, so they just said, God said, and they put that in the Quran, that God said, murder the Jews, you know, whatever, behind the tree, whatever the expression is and so on. In any case, this is the genius, this is the depth of the problem that Judaism has, the problem that the world has with Judaism. And it never disappears. Never. And it'll go on to the end of time, until the Moshe finally says, I'm tired of this whole business. And also the Rebbeinu will reveal Himself. And could you believe the shock when people realize that the nation that they so despised, Even ha'amasa haboinim, the stone that the builders despised, hoyser rosh pina, became the cornerstone. Let's hope that it's this year, right? With the entrance of Mashiach, and then we should be redeemed from all this terrible events that occur on a daily basis. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
It seems like this concept of Amalek is actually an inherent truth in God's design of the Torah. In other words,
in a certain sense, yes. Because really, you know what the ultimate concept of man is? It's the same as Adam or Rishon. What was the real concept of Adam? To eat from the tree or not? No, that's not his conflict, right? His problem wasn't the diet. His problem is who's the real God, right? Is God Himself subject to another force called the tree? Or can I become God? Man rebels against God. That's his conflict. So by becoming God, what he's really doing is demoting God and saying that I can become you, and therefore, I can equal you. The concept of man is the concept of Adam. Who's the boss, ultimately? Anybody else? Yeah. Ladies first. Ladies first.
You said some hate the Molech, or some meta Molech, or some kind of Molech. You said when the soul is not to be happy when the seeds around.
I want to tell you something. Are you asking why we hate them or why God hates them?
No, you said God hates them.
Yeah.
I can understand.
Well, it says also God hates Esau. God doesn't hate you. See, here's the difference. A racist is somebody who hates somebody because of who you are. God can hate somebody because of what you do. That's the difference.
But if some...
Wait, let me just finish. God is not a racist. Remember, racism is, I hate you because of who you are. You know, if you're black, I hate blacks. What do you mean? I'm black. What do you want from me, right? I didn't do anything. No, I hate blacks, right? That's racism. Because of who you are. But if you're a guy that goes and kills people, I don't hate you because of who you are. I hate you because of what you do. You're killing everybody. You see? That's the incredible difference. God doesn't hate Amalek because of who they are. It's what they do that they want to destroy and commit suicide because they want to overthrow his sovereignty. That's a don't confuse racism with behavior. You see what I'm saying?
The Rabbi introduced the thing the Shir started with Hanachos from psychology.
Who? Yes, because I wanted to. Well, that's yeah.
Do we also find these things in the Torah sources as well?
In Torah?
Yeah.
About what?
Those self-preservation that what drives us is self.
Yeah, we actually find it. Yeah.
Excellent.
I agree.
Want to know where? I know.
Sure. Okay. I wasn't going to push
You want to know what the question was? Sorry.
You want to repeat the question? He wants to know. I mentioned certain fundamental psychological drives. So, and the most fundamental in terms of what we do is the drive to remove inferiority, self-worth. The drive to achieve self-worth is the most fundamental drive. Below that is self-preservation, but I'm not going to want that just to say. Animals have that drive too. But notice an animal doesn't have self-worth. An animal's not concerned with its worth. Notice? Tigers don't have problems. That's why tigers never go to a therapist. I've never seen a tiger that was a therapist. You see? Because tigers don't have any problems with self-worth. But you know what they do have problems with? Self-preservation. Territorial. That's why if you muzzle in on their territory, they will kill you. Not because they have to prove they're somebody. They are somebody. Right? It's because you're taking away their food. That's the difference between an animal and man. Only a man has problems with his worth. Animals don't have that problem.
I'll ask the second question. How is it Rav in Yerushalayim for? Is it Rav giving classes on Gemara?
I give a class in my house Monday morning from 10:30 to 12 in learning how to significantly improve your ability to learn.
Rav's teaching. So I'd really like to come.
So come, you're right. It's an open chair. It's 10:30 in my house from 10:30 to 12 Monday morning. I live in Rehov Rashi, 91.
Go ahead.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm glad that in the end you mentioned Islam.
Islam, yes.
I'm so surprised that you didn't mention them in all the different religions. And I'm also so surprised why we are so tolerant towards them and claiming that their God is the same as our God.
Who said that?
Well, I hear all the time that Allah
Is God? No. That's a tremendous mistake people make. You know why? You know what the history of that is? Arabs, before Muhammad came along, what religion did the Arabs have? They had polytheism. They believed in many gods, different spirits and so on. Right? The most powerful of all the little gods was a god called Allah. You know that? But it was part of the pantheon of the deities that Arabs worshipped. So along came Muhammad, and he said, wait a minute, forget about everybody else. I'm going to take Allah, who is the most powerful of everyone, and I'm going to elevate him to be the supreme. So Allah really, most people are not aware of that. Allah is the supreme being among all the other gods, you see, and that's what he really did. And so on. And then obviously what he tried to do is try to legitimatize that. So therefore he had, if I remember correctly, he had a servant called Abraham, who taught him Torah in that sense. Yes. And that's why Islam is the outgrowth of Torah. I mean, look at the five principles, tenets of pillars of Islam. It's all dinam. It's either kapara, emunah, aliyah, oil, and regel. You have to go to Mecca once in your life. That's what it is.
Why is it considered monotheism? Why is it not considered something?
Because in the present day form, they believe in one God. They don't believe in any of the others. What Muhammad did is he elevated that one. Again, Islam is monotheistic. That's all it is. Monotheism simply means one God. But it's not the Jewish God. I mean, if you look at their God, what kind of God is a God that says you need to kill an infidel? Judaism doesn't say that. You want to... Judaism doesn't care if you don't believe in God. Nobody kills anybody. Do what you want. It's your bechira, it's your free will. Yeah, if you're going to interfere with my ability, that's different. You see, Amalek wanted to kill the Jews. That's a different story. You know what I'm saying? But other than that, hey, you can do whatever you want. It's a free country. Or I should say free will. Islam doesn't allow that. The problem with Islam, and that's why there will never be peace. Anybody who thinks there will be peace with Islam is an absolute idiot. Why? Because, I'll tell you why. Because the problem with Islam is that they are theologically driven. They can't allow peace. The only way you can relate to Islam is one of two ways. Either they are under you or they're over you. There is no such thing as equality. You see. And why? Because they are theologically driven. The Quran does not allow them it allows them to others to exist. But if you do exist, you've got to be a dhimmi. A dhimmi means a subservient person. There's no such thing as equality. A Jew, hey, you can be equal to me. You know, just because you don't believe what I believe, you're equal to me in the sense that you're not, I don't issue laws where I subjugate you, to inferiority. Of course not. That's why it's impossible for Islam to make peace with Israel. In fact, Islam cannot make peace with anybody. Because their theology denies equality. That's the concept of jihad. Jihad means you need to rule. That's it. There's no other option.
Amalek or not?
What?
Are they in the same line as Amalek or not?
No. No, not really. It's just a strategy. What they did is they gave over to their God, right, murderous intentions, that's all. They want to murder, fine. So their God says to murder. No problem. The Christians did it also, in a certain sense. That's why they murdered so many Jews. Anyway, yeah.
I have a two-sided question. I have a two-sided question.
Two-sided?
Yeah.
Sounds like a double-edged sword.
It may relate to the last statement the author made.
Yeah.
There is a measure that talks about the idea that they were so much hate towards Israel when we were coming out of Egypt, coming into the land, that it was like we were like a hot tub, and they were a cold drop of water to come in.
That refers to... No, that's something else.
Let me just finish this.
Okay.
And not all terrorists are... Not all Muslims are terrorists, but those that are Muslims.
Yes.
So there's this concept of suicide bombers. This concept of suicide bomber reminds me of this drop of water going into the bathtub to call itself off. It's going to die. It's going to die out.
It'll be burned to death.
So I do see some kind of a...
The
question is it true that Amalek transmigrated to different...
Yes. The Zohar says, which is really very interesting, there's a Zohar that says that Amalek will ultimately merge with Ishmael. Now, what does Ishmael do? Suicide. Isn't that interesting? So does Amalek. It's a Zohar. Okay, there you go. Right? Great. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the answer of Judaism's, or the way you explain the person has basic problem with self-esteem? How does Judaism interact openly with the psychology of a person?
You mean what does Judaism do about your need for self-esteem? Is that what you're asking? Well, what's interesting about Judaism is it's a paradox. The greater bitul hayesh, the greater negation of self you have, the greater you are, which is interesting. So your self-worth comes from negation of self. What is that called? You know what it's called? What's the greatest of all madregas of a Jew? And the answer is humility. Ve'oish Moshe haya onaf mikol adam sheba'aretz. Onaf. Incredibly humble. Yet that's what made him so great. He was the greatest humble man, and therefore he was the greatest Jew. You see, but that's a paradox. And the answer to that is your self-worth doesn't come because you are searching for ways to feel like somebody. The real self-worth comes from the greatest humility, and therefore you're worth the most. It's a paradox. You see? So in a certain sense, you actually by negating, not self, you can't negate self, but by negating your importance, or you actually become the greatest. You know, they tell the story of Rabbi Akiva. You know, Rabbi Akiva was, for those who know Rabbi Akiva, one of the incredible gadol. So they said, someone once said to him, you know, Rabbi Akiva was a tremendous honor, whatever, and so on. Anyway, he said, you know, by the way, there's an incredible honor that lives in this village, homo person. You know? So they told this Rabbi Akiva, so Rabbi Akiva said, I gotta see this guy. I gotta see what a guy who's an incredible honor. So he went to the village, and of course, Rabbi Akiva, the village, you know, they honored him, said, what would you like, you know? Well, I want to visit this guy. Let's say his name is Reuven, right? I want to visit Reuven, you know? And all of a sudden he goes to Reuven's house, and he says, I'd like to stay with you for 2 weeks. And he stays with him for 2 weeks, right? And he sees it's true. This Reuven is incredible. His humility is awesome. So he's about to leave after 2 weeks. And he says to Reuven, he says, you know, what I saw about you is just incredible. But I have one problem, one question. It says, you know, Ish Moshe ha'ya'anaf b'kol oretz. The man Moses was the most humble man. Yet I see that you rival him. So the guy said to him, Reuven said to him, you know, I also had that problem. Here's the guy. You know, it's like the guy, you know, in Europe used to be a Wasserschlepper. You know, Wasserschlepper. You know, they didn't have water like they have today, the sink, right? You have to go buy water. The guy used to, like a milkman, right? The waterman, right? So a waterman, what kind of job is that? The schlepper is that, you know, it's so and so forth, you know. So a guy once said to me when he's buying some water from the guy, he says, you know, you must feel terrible about yourself, because I mean, what kind of parnosa, you know, schlepping water and so on, you know. He says, you know, right, I got a real problem, but I want to tell you something. I'm the best water schlepper there is in the city. You can always be a MacGyver in some way, I don't care what it is. You know, because a Gaiva really is a distortion of self. I don't get to Gaiva what that really is in Anivas, but the essential idea is, to answer your question, Judaism, the value that Judaism places on a person, which is real value, okay, is the greatest honor. It's a paradox. So by being a nobody, so to speak, or recognizing, not that you're a nobody, you're not. You are whatever God made you. You see, but by recognizing who you are, right, as really insignificant, that itself gives you the greatest value of all. And therefore God will attach himself to you, Dvekus. The greater the Anivas, the greater the Dvekus. Okay? I mean, there's a lot more to talk, but that's basically it. Yes?
Would you like
what was that?
Would you like to comment on the story of the Noah of Rabbi Eliezer, where the strategy that the Chachamim voted against God, so to speak, on the halachic ruling of the Tanur of Rabbi Eliezer?
Oh, you mean the Imbov Mitzir?
Yeah. Maybe tell the story to the crowd, and in terms of the strategy, God says that the Chachamim of overcome me, they voted against me.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of the strategy, so that we sort of overcame those opinions in a sense.
These are Tanoim. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are Tanoim. There was a dispute about an oven. The Gemara brings it down. There's a dispute about an oven, if it's Tomei, can become Tomei or whatever. Can it become Tomei defiled, whatever, right? There's a whole dispute between the great Rabbi Eliezer ben Ruchnis. He's a Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva. Phenomenal person. And then there's Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. I mean, these are incredible people, right? So there's an argument, right? So each one wanted to prove that they were right, you know? So Rabbi Eliezer said, if I'm right, let that wall bend. And it bent. It's a miracle. But they were so great that God listened to them. So it bent. So they said to Rabbi Eliezer, I'm sorry. God cannot give you proof you're right, because once the Torah was given, then we're the only ones that can agree what's the right course. God gave it to man's dominion, what halacha they accept. God can no longer say, I agree with Rabbi Eliezer, and so on. But that's because God gave permission God gave the authority of the ultimate halacha to the chachamim. So it's not because they think they're great. They have the legal right to decide, and God cannot mix in. Why? Because he doesn't want to mix in. You see, he gave a din that it's a Sanhedrin or a Chachamim. They decide the law. I will no longer decide the law. The Torah was given once at Sinai. And after that, that's what they mean by Torah la b'shamayim. Torah is not in heaven. What does that mean? It came from heaven. But once it was given, then God gave the authority, transferred the authority. Who decides what the halacha is? It's the Chachamim, not me. And they have their right. That's why you have Chachamim. The Gemara is filled with fights, machlekes, because that's the way Jewish law operates. It is the Chachamim, man, that determines the law. God doesn't determine, but God wants man to use the rules of decision making that He does. There's all kinds of rules how He decides on, but the decision of what the halacha is that. But I don't do with humility. They were tanoim. They felt they're nobodies. Themselves, they were incredible. But they had incredible anivas, but they knew that they had the authority, so they can use it. Look, Moshe Rabbeinu with Korach. Right? Korach wanted to usurp the authority of Moshe Rabbeinu. So what did Moshe Rabbeinu say? He said, hey, what are you doing? You don't have enough. Let's make a test. I thought Moshe was enough. Why did you define Korach? You see? That had nothing to do with Anivas. Moshe Rabbeinu knew who he was, but he had to defy Korach because Korach was creating an incredible danger to Klal Yisrael. He was questioning the transmission process that maybe Moshe Rabbeinu issued laws that were his own laws and not from God. You see. You know why the earth swallowed them up? Why the earth? That's a bizarre punishment. That Korach. Right? Incredible. And the earthquake followed him. It's like, even seismologists, guys who study earthquakes, would stand in wonder at what happened. Right? The earthquake followed Korach and all the other 250 guys that died. And it was incredible. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a local earthquake that followed these guys. Why did God kill them that way? Or whatever He did to them. Right? And the answer is, because if you break the authority of Moshe, then the whole Judaism doesn't stand on any ground. So measure for measure, since you are trying to make a crack in the ground of Judaism, the ground will kill you.
Balaam's donkey.
What?
Balaam's donkey.
Yeah.
Created with the
yeah, okay, right, I'm just giving you look, and so on. When there had to be men, there had to be men. But they realized who they were. They're nobodies. But they granted the authority to decide the law, and they used it. Even if they felt like nobody, tremendous anivas. Not a contradiction. Yes?
I think when you asked the question just in the previous, but the question is really, is it possible to have a direct experience of what God requires, other than going through tradition?
I'm not clear what you mean by experience. Well, people learn Torah, so the Torah is the will of God.
Well, the Torah is transmitted.
The Torah is transmitted, but it's a document that reveals His will. Right?
Does anybody have a direct experience of what the divine sort of...
What divine will is? Yes, Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? God reveals it directly.
That's through somebody else.
That's called a prophetic experience. A prophet has a direct experience. You see? There's a whole concept called prophecy. It's a phenomenon. Right? The concept of prophecy is to experience God directly. No documents. It's a direct transmission. And there were thousands of prophets in the days of old, right?
Can I experience such a...
Can you?
Yes.
Voices coming out all the time.
Can I experience direct transmission from God?
Yes, you can. And I will tell you something. There are different levels or degrees of prophecy. The original prophecy, I'm not going to go into the differences, you cannot experience for reasons. However, there are lower levels of prophecy. The lowest level is called Ruach HaKodesh. You can, divine spirit. There are people who have Ruach HaKodesh, which means that all of a sudden they know. It's not the same as prophecy, it's a difference. But it is to experience the will of God instantly. It arises in your mind, and all of a sudden you know. That you can experience. But in order to experience that, you need to observe the Torah. Because the mitzvahs clear you out and they raise you in your shoma to have that experience. So you can do it. If you really work at it, you can get Ruach HaKodesh. Yes. It'll take a while.
Ask God to give me,
but you can do it, yeah. That's available to everybody today. Ruach HaKodesh. Okay?
Yes. One last comment, or not really a question. We also mentioned that this shiur was in commemoration of Moshe Rabbeinu's Yahrtzeit.
Oh yeah, well, yeah.
So I just wanted to mention to the last question, because we mentioned that all the prophets, whoever came after Moshe, received the chokmah and the inspiration through the emanation of Moshe. Through him?
Yeah, okay. That's an aside. But to connect Moshe Rabbeinu's Yahrtzeit, because today was Zayin Adar, right? And this year is the last thing I mentioned. The Torah praises Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Kasher tzivu Hashem es Moshe, as God commanded Moses. That is the exact opposite of what Amalek did. So there you are. That's the connection. Moshe was the antithesis of Amalek. Whatever he did was an absolute observance of what God wanted. Amalek is the compromise God. So Moshe Rabbeinu really and Amalek are exactly antithetical. So that connects it all.
Is that probably the purpose why Hashem has to introduce Amalek, to see the opposite parallel for us to learn at from it? But it seems like
Amalek had free will. God didn't force them to do what they did.
No, but as Hashem has created the Torah in love, but here He creates this whole system of generations where we have to suffer. Jews have to suffer,
yes,
because it's written, and it's going to happen.
No, it's written. If you don't observe the commandments, you suffer. But it's not written you have to suffer. It is written that you have a job to do. That's true. Adam li'omer yulad. A man is created. He's born to work. A melus. He has to. There's a job, and you have to have effort for that job. But you're not born to suffer. Doesn't say that.
No, I wasn't
fine. Okay.
implying that.
That's fine.
But like, how to explain the Haman and Purim?
I don't know what the question is.
It's just.
Why is there always an Amalek in the world? Why I always have to suffer from an Amalek in the world?
You know, God, for whatever reason, that's another shift, the whole divine plan. But the essential idea is simple. I mean, there's a divine plan, and that plan entails or demands free will. Once you have free will, you can do whatever you want. You could serve God or deny God or whatever you want to do, right? And I'm not going into why there has to be free will and so on, but that's why. Many people choose to do evil. And if they do evil, that's their prerogative to exercise their free will. You know? That's part. God wants there to be free will. I'm not going into why, but once you have the concept of free will, you immediately have the concept that you can go two directions, right? That's why.
But isn't the reason for the Jewish people is their own lack of unity? That's why we have oneness?
Oh no! It's because the Jews do sins. It's the sins of the Jews that causes everything. Period. If they didn't sin, the Mashiach would have come a long time ago. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we try to ask these people. The Jews coming out of Egypt and now the creation of Amalek. Were they somehow involved by some sort of process that allowed Amalek to come? Was it totally free will decision by Amalek to do what they did?
Well, fundamentally, it is a free will decision. Look, Amalek always had this. It's just that they recognized that the Jewish religion in Egypt was an incredible threat. But they couldn't do it because that meant going up against Egypt. I mean, Egypt would never allow them to kill the Jews because Egypt needed them for slaves. So they had to wait, who knows how many, tens and tens of years, hundreds of years. Because Amalek really is the grandson, if you think about that, is the grandson of Esau. You know what I'm saying? Who knows how many years they had to wait. Look, his grandfather was Esau. We know what Esau was, you know. You see, so I mean, he's not very far from his Zeta, as they say. So they couldn't attack the Jews in Egypt. They had to wait. Oh, The opportune time came. The Jews are out of Egypt. Egypt cannot stop them anymore because they're destroyed. Now we can kill the Jews. But they've been plotting this for years.
Maybe another question.
Yeah.
So how did Esau come from Yaakov and from Yitzchak and how did he be their son?
How did he what?
How is he their son? So how two tzaddikim have...
I mean, how did a guy with a father like Yitzchak and a grandfather like Avram, how did the guy turn out like this? Is that your question?
That's the grandfather of Amalek.
And his grandson is Amalek, because his son was Eliphaz, right? And Eliphaz had Amalek, right? And what a yichus, right? So your question is, how in the world did this happen? And the answer is, the one answer. So I just could tell you one drop of the answer. First of all, the answer, at least minimally, is that you all have free will. Okay? But the real answer is you have to know who Esau really was. And I'll ask you only one question. And that'll bring up the real idea. It's a long share, But who is Esau? How many of us are there? Avot are there? 3. How many? 3. How many imahot are there? 4. Do you ever wonder why? Why is it there's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? And on the other side you got Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. Hey, what happened here? There's something uneven here. And the answer is, what's the answer? Because, that we know. No. Wait, because, she was supposed to marry him. But his question is, how in the world did Esau turn out? Because the answer is, there are really 4 of us, not 3. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Esau. Wow. Esau was an Ov. You see, the gematria of Esau is twice Yaakov with a Vav. They both had 2 different jobs. That's why they were twins, because they both had almost identical jobs. But Esau was an Ov. But Esau is a story of an Ov that failed. Because it can happen to anybody. Listen, there are Rosh Hashivas out there, and their sons are frying. But the real concept is that Esau was an Ov. In fact, had he done his job, Esau would have been twice as great as Yaakov Avinu had Esau done his job. But Esau had free will, and he failed. At 15 years old, he failed. But he had incredible potential. You have no idea. I can give you one idea to show you how great Esau was had he been religious. Right? And it's really in line with this year, and I'm going to end with this idea. Okay? Esau was an incredible Bagaiva. But Yibes Esau is Abechora. And Esau despised the birthright. Yes? He despised it. The Torah tells us that kind of business is Gaiva. How do you despise a birthright when that's your claim to spirituality? Because the firstborn was a claim in those days. Okay. So it was seen as Gaiva. Let me ask you something. What is the most, for somebody who's arrogant, what is the most difficult thing that he can do? You know what it is? Listen to authority. An arrogant person cannot listen to authority because who are you to tell me what to do? Do you know who I am? Right? Got that? Yet we find that Esau, he went off. But Esau did observe one mitzvah. What was that mitzvah? What is kibbud ovayim? Authority. But the incredible thing is that Omer Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, great man in the Talmud, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that he says on himself, I am the greatest man in my generation in honoring my father and mother. What I'm saying, I'm it. I did the greatest observance of that mitzvah. Yet, this is what it says in the Gemara. Yet I find Esau, my uncle Esau, the Seta Esau because right, the uncle Esau, was greater than me. In what way? When Esau went in to see Yitzchak, he took off his regular clothing and he put on his Shabbos begodim to visit his father. Who does that? Today everybody says, hey Dad, get up because I want to sit down. Right? Yet Esav had such kibbud over aim that he would change his garments before he'd even go in to see his father. His kibbud was awesome. But how can that be? Because Esav was an incredible megalomaniac. Yet the mitzvah he observed was what? Was the most difficult for a megalomaniac to observe. So what did we see? That if he wanted to, he could have observed the Torah. Because if he did that, I guarantee everything else is downhill. You see? That shows you the power of Esav. But he had free will. He decided to throw it out. You know, obviously Olam Hazeh spoke more to him than Olam Haba. You know, I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I'm just giving you something to go home with. Anything else?
Thank you.
Okay.